I'm Sean McInnes. I'm the sustainability specialist in the Office of Sustainability at UNC Greensboro. And we're joined today by Dr. Kim Komatsu, who is an associate professor and Florence Schaefer Distinguished Scholar of Science in the UNCG Department of Biology, where she runs the Community Dynamics Lab. She and her students work across a broad range of sites within the United States. It's a big list. They study invasive species in California grasslands, rangelands, sustainability in Montana, Wyoming, and Kansas, grassland dynamics in Kansas, and forest dynamics, and even soybean agriculture in Maryland. She's a former senior scientist with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, the recipient of too many grants to name from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the National Science Foundation in particular. And her research has also been published in numerous scientific journals. And last but not least, she is a very formidable opponent during board game nights with colleagues. So I just want to welcome and say thank you to Dr. Komatsu for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you, Kim.
Great. Thank you, Sean, for the introduction. Hopefully you can all see my screen here, and you've done a great job of introducing my study system, so I don't have to tell you too much about who I am. As Sean said, I've been at UNC Greensboro for about 2.5 years now as an associate professor in the biology department. But also, as he mentioned, I've done more than 2 decades of research on ecology, specifically community ecology, thinking about the interactions between plants and their consumers and beneficial microbes in ecosystems ranging from the West Coast to the Central Great Plains all the way over here to the East Coast. So I'm excited to talk to you today. Webinars are kind of a black box, and so I wanted to start us off with an engagement question. Hopefully you all have access to the chat, and so I want to ask you all to get a sense of who you are. What is your favorite animal? So if you could type into the chat, I'll read some of the answers out. What's your favorite animal? Crows from Sean. So a great bird species, very intelligent. I like it. Any other volunteers to tell us your favorite animal? Penguins, another great bird species. Lions, orcas, awesome mammals. Awesome. These are some good answers. So there's one group that seems to be conspicuously absent from this list, which are insects, which I anticipated to be the case, although I do see jumping spiders. I love that. So I'll tell you my favorite animal is a tiger beetle. So tiger beetles are a group of beetles. They're known for their beautiful iridescent colors. They're like little jewels in our forests and grasslands. And they're also really fierce predators. And so here's a couple of examples of tiger beetles that we can find from all over the world. Again, they're very beautiful iridescent colors. And the fastest known tiger beetle species can run 5.6 miles per hour. So this little beetle is running 171 lengths of its body every second. This is incredibly fast. And if we put this in human terms, if we think about a 6-foot-tall human running 171 lengths of their body per second, they would be running 720 miles per hour. So this is almost as fast as the speed of sound. So if a human could run as fast as a tiger beetle could run, we would almost be breaking the sound barrier. So this is just one example of a super awesome insect. And today, my goal is to talk to you about many different groups of insects, some that we might love, some that we might hate, and hopefully by the end of this talk, I've convinced you that we must have them all in our ecosystems. They're really critical for sustainability and conservation. So I'll start out here by talking about what is an insect. So insects, many of us learn in elementary school. They're groups of animals that have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They have 6 legs. There's a few other characteristics. There's a couple other groups of animals that have these characteristics of head, abdomen, thorax, and 6 legs. But in addition, insects have compound eyes that help them see the world, as well as exposed mouth parts to help them eat the world. So there's many, many, many different species of insects, as I mentioned. And you might be asking yourself, how many species of insects are on the planet? We've heard there's this big diversity of them in shapes and sizes and colors. How many species of insects are out there? And I think what's really remarkable is that we don't actually know the answer to this question. So we know that the Earth's circumference is 40,075 kilometers. We know down to the kilometer the circumference of the planet that we live on. We know the structure of the atom, right? These super tiny particles that make up everything around us. But we have no clue how many insect species there are in the world. They're out there hiding in plain sight. But we have a little bit of an idea of how many there might be. So far, we've described about 1 million insect species on planet Earth. And we estimate there's between 1.5 million to 5 million species of insects out there. And scientific consensus is building around the number 3.5 million. So this is a lot of different species of bugs out in the world. And how do we know how many insects are out there? So we have a few different methods to tell. We know the rates of new species being described over time. So as we are discovering new species to science, we're adding them into the scientific literature, and we can see, are we finding the same number of species over the decades, or are we starting to plateau in the number of insect species that we're seeing? We can also really intensively sample an area. So the scientist in this picture is fumigating, so spraying insecticide up into the tops of the forest canopy. And as all the bugs die, they're falling down into this plastic tarp that they've laid over the forest floor. Then they can go and count and identify all of the species of insects that they find there, and then extrapolate from that one forest site to think about how many insect species might there be in all of the forests in that region, or all of the forests of the world. This is another way we can take a guess of how many insects are out there. And then more recently, we're using molecular tools like DNA barcoding to be able to tell species apart that you might not be able to tell apart just with your eyes. So we know there's a lot of insect species out there. And when we compare this to all other known animal species, we see that there's a huge difference here. So there's about 1 million species of insects that have been described. The next most speciose group are the mollusks. So these are things like our snails. They only have 100,000 species. The arachnids, so things like our spiders, again, have about 100,000 species, and it only goes down from there. So mammals are down here near the bottom. We know about 6,500 species of mammals, which is way few when you compare that to our 100 or our million insects that we know exist in the world. So there's a lot of insect species out there. And then when you look at what kinds of insects are these insect species, we see a similar type of distribution. And I think this quote from J.S. Haldane, who was a famous British evolutionary biologist and geneticist, really says it all in terms of what insect species are in the world. When he would be asked by people what he could infer about the creator based on what he sees in the world around him, this evolutionary biologist would answer that the creator must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles because there are so many beetle species on the planet. So about 45% of known insect species are beetles. Those are our coleoptera here on the left-hand side of this graph. The next most speciose group of insects are the Lepidoptera. These are our butterflies and moths. Then the Hymenoptera. These are bees, wasps, and ants. Our true bugs, our flies, and then it goes down from there. So really, if you're thinking about if you pick an animal species at random out of the world, it's probably going to be an insect, and it's probably going to be a beetle. So this next number I have for you here is 10 quintillion. This is a big number. There's a lot of zeros here. This is the estimate of the number of individual insects that are flying around in the world around us. 10 quintillion. And this is a huge number when you compare it to other things that we see every day. We have about 3 trillion trees on the planet. We have 50 billion birds and 8 billion people. And so this number of 10 quintillion, I've lined up all the zeros for you here, really shows just how many insects are out there in our environment. So they're all around us. It's no wonder people have strong feelings about insects. And so I'm going to ask for your participation again here in the chat, thinking about the emotions that insects evoke. And when I think about emotions that people have in society, I like to turn to art as a way of capturing how society feels about a topic. So I'm going to show you a few different images here of insects depicted in art. And I want you to leave a message in the chat that tells me how these images make you feel. So this first image is a piece that's actually right here in the Weatherspoon Museum here at UNCG. It's on display in exhibitions every once in a while, so you can go check it out there. This piece is titled The Swarm of Red Ants, and it's from a whole portfolio of insect pieces made by Edward Ruscha in the 1970s. So think about, or let me know in the chat, how this image makes you feel. Is it positive or negative? You feel surrounded, you have caution, itchy. Oh, I like that description. Overwhelmed. Totally. These are all very reasonable feelings when you're seeing this swarm of red ants, right? Here's another one. Admittedly, this is not an insect, but it is a piece of art that I saw several years ago at an art museum in San Francisco, and it captured my imagination to the point where I was putting together this talk. I was still thinking about this sculpture. So this is, again, a piece within a series by Luis Burgess, pretty well known, of a spider. You can imagine this crawling up your wall. So creepy is an adjective we might use to describe this. Any other thoughts about the emotions the spider evokes in you? Getting goosebumps? Totally. So these are mostly negative feelings, right, that we're having about these insects, or again, a spider, which is not an insect. So oftentimes insects evoke feelings of disgust or fear or fright. And for good reason, right? Oftentimes people have these feelings of hatred towards insects. And this feeling of hatred is not necessarily unreasonable. So I just want to share one story with you here about a reason why we might be afraid of insects. So this is an example. This photo is a flea. Specifically, it's the rat flea. It's just the look of it is not very appealing to begin with. And the life cycle of a flea is pretty typical for most insect life cycles. So we have adult fleas that lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch and turn into larvae, or we would call them maggot-like larvae, right? Those larvae grow over time. They form a cocoon and metamorphosize into adult fleas. And this cycle continues over and over again. And all of this is taking place within the host of the rat flea, which is the rat. So rat fleas like to bite their hosts, they suck their blood, and that's what gives them the nutrients they need to complete this life cycle. And if their host dies, no big deal. The rat flea just moves on to a new rat. It finds a new host. So this happens in nature all around us. This is just one example of a parasite of a mammal, but it becomes a bit of a horror story when you start to think about what these fleas might be transmitting among these rats. So in this case, we have these green bacteria that are depicted here as a cartoon. These bacteria get ingested by these fleas when they're feeding on these rats, and they actually form a biofilm, kind of like a crust within the gut of these fleas. And so when the flea is trying to suck in more blood, it gets blocked by that biofilm. And so it regurgitates its food, splat, back out into the open wound that it has created in this rat. So it's spitting back out the blood meal mixed together with these bacteria, which is pretty gross. And so if you think about this, it's transmitting these bacteria onto its new hosts, right? And this poor flea, it's just trying to get a meal. It's getting hungrier and hungrier because it can't swallow any of its food. Its hosts keep dying, so it's getting pretty aggressive in trying to find a new host. And eventually, this flea might land on you. So this, again, it sounds like a horror story, but this happens in real life. And this bacteria is Yersinia pestis. You might know where I'm going with this. This bacteria causes the plague, right? So it's harbored by rodents, it's transmitted by fleas, and it's highly contagious. So the plague has caused 3 different pandemics in known history, including the Black Death, which was the largest pandemic that we know about in recorded history. It killed 50 million people, so about half of Europe's population, all because of the transmission of this bacteria by an insect, this flea, right? So it's pretty scary stuff. And there's many primary disease vectors on our planet that are insect parasites. So some insect disease vectors are things like mosquitoes, which are shown in this top picture here. They carry things like malaria, dengue, Zika, West Nile, yellow fever, and many other bloodborne diseases. We have our kissing bugs down here in the bottom. They're a true bug, and they carry things like Chagas disease. And then we have fleas, which I just touched on, carry things like plague and typhus. So, of course, it's reasonable for us to be afraid of many different insects because of their role in vectoring diseases within human populations. So again, reasonable to hate them sometimes, but now I want to show you a couple new images that might evoke different feelings. So again, if you share in the chat what you think of when you see images like this. So this is a beautiful monarch butterfly flying from its natural habitat towards the city over the ocean. This is from a portfolio called Intersex instead of Insects by Peter Cooper relatively recently. It's a whole series of cartoons. What do you think of when you're seeing this butterfly flying across the water here? Tanner says he's sad because there's probably not any food for it in the city. What else are people thinking? What emotions do you have? It's beautiful. I like it. I'll show you one other one here. This is a piece called Wonder by an artist, Jennifer Angus, where she uses the bodies of insects as wall motifs. So she's created this almost wallpaper-like design by affixing insects to the walls, showing, again, the wonder and beauty of nature, right? So we might have feelings of admiration for these insects on these long migrations or see the beauty in their forms, right? So lots of people, for particular groups of insects, have feelings of love, which is also a really valid thing. And I just want to share two examples of insects that might not often get a lot of love, but that I think are super cool and would like to point out how awesome they are. So this is a slowed down video of a dragonfly that has spotted its prey in the air, and it has launched off of its perch to reach up and capture that prey in the basket of its arms so that it can eat it. And dragonflies are actually super cool predators. They're extreme predators for two different reasons. The first is that they have amazing vision. So they have 360-degree vision because of these huge eyeballs they have on the front of their head. So almost their whole head is made up of an eyeball, or two eyeballs, a pair of eyes. And they have a wider color spectrum in their vision than humans do. So they're flying around seeing 360-degree views of technicolor views around them. Because their eyes are so big, they have to dedicate 80% of their brain to interpreting those images that are coming in through those massive eyes. So that's one reason why they're such good predators. They also have 4 independently beating wings. So this is different from most insects. Most insects flap their wings in synchrony with each other. Dragonflies can move their wings all 4 independently, which allows them to perfectly hover in place. It allows them to fly backwards. It allows them to turn on a hairpin, and they can fly up to 30 miles an hour, which is incredibly fast for a relatively small insect. And because of these two things, their awesome vision and their amazing flight, they have a 90% kill rate. So when a dragonfly sees prey in the sky, 90% of the time, it's going to catch that prey to be able to eat it. So again, they're extreme awesome predators. And for humans, this is great because they are mostly eating gnats and mosquitoes. So if you're down by the lake or the shore, you can thank the dragonflies for the lack of mosquitoes or gnats that are bothering you at these aquatic sites. Here's another example of an insect you probably wouldn't think to love offhand. I can tell you personally, I do not love having American cockroaches when they come into my home here in the South, but they are, again, incredibly agile insects. So this is an image of a cockroach, again, slowed down, running headlong into a wall. And when it hits that wall, it makes a 90-degree turn and just keeps on running up. And again, this incredible agility is something that we can take advantage of as humans. So people are designing robots for doing things like clearing minefields by using the movement of these roaches as an example for how we can have robots that can climb over rough terrain in our environments. So an insect that we might not think to love, but we should probably love just for admiration of its agility in the world. So regardless of how you feel about insects, you might love them, you might hate them. For the rest of the talk, I want to convince you that we have got to have them in our ecosystems and in our lives. So insects play many vital roles in our ecosystems, and I want to just talk you through over the next several minutes a few of the many roles that they play here on our planet. The first is that they're incredible pollinators. So pollination as a syndrome evolved with the origin of the flower. So flowers evolved about 130 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. By the time flowers arrived on the scene, insects had already been around for 350 million years. So insects way predate flowers. As soon as flowers showed up, insects started using the pollen as a food source and transmitting pollen from flower to flower, helping them to reproduce. So without insects, we would have a much lower diversity of flowers in the world. Insects pollinate about 80 to 95% of all of the world's flowering plants. And importantly, they pollinate about 35% of our food crops. So if you look down at your dinner plate tonight, when you sit down to dinner, you could think about all of the different plants that are on your plate. Probably about a third of those plants would not be there if you didn't have insects. Things like potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, almonds, apples, strawberries, all of these things are pollinated by insects. In addition to being pollinators, they're also herbivores, which means they eat plants. So about 40% of insects consume plants, which is really important because it helps to shape our plant communities and it keeps vegetation in check. And we often think about, the herbivores that are eating the plants in our vegetable gardens. We think of them as a bad thing, but the vast majority of insects on Earth are not destructive in terms of their herbivory. They're just living their lives as a natural part of the ecosystem. And so again, I want to take a little detour into my research program to tell you about the role of insects in a place that I love, the tallgrass prairie of Kansas, which is part of our Great Plains grassland ecosystems. And here in the tallgrass prairie, we have a system that's dominated by grasses. We often think of herbivores in this system as large consumers like bison or cattle. And so we wanted to determine what is the role that insects play in shaping these plant communities when you compare them to these big grazers like bison. And so what we did is we went out and we built a bunch of fences. So you could see in this picture here, we have these fences that are keeping the bison from going into those plots and consuming the plants. And you might be able to tell if you have a keen eye that the grass is growing a bit taller inside of the fence than it is outside of the fence. And then in addition, we built smaller fences inside of those big fences to remove small mammals. So that's what this shiny bit is around here. This is our small mammal exclusion plots. So we're preventing the mammals from climbing up and into those plots. And then we also went out and applied insecticide. So here's a couple of graduate students working on the project here from UNCG, where they went out and in half of those plots, they sprayed insecticide to remove the insects as well. And what we found through this experiment is that when we have bison in the system, they're eating about 35% of the plant material. So about a third of the plants were consumed by the bison. The small mammals reduce about 14% of the plant material, and then the insects reduce about 7% of the plant material. So certainly the amount of plants that are being eaten by these consumers scales with their size, but it's not a linear or proportional scale, right? So it seems like the insects are potentially eating more than you would expect based on their tiny size compared to a large bison. And what was really interesting is we found not only were insects consuming a relatively large proportion of the plant growth, but they also were selectively eating different plant species. So the bison and cattle in these grassland ecosystems really target the grasses. They like to eat those yummy, nutritious grasses to help them grow. Whereas the insects prefer to eat the forbs, the herbaceous flowering plants in the system. And so what this means is that when we have a system that has insects present, we have this beautiful grassy system, which is great for cattle production because again, cattle like to eat grass. And when we remove the insects from the system, this is a picture of one of our plots, we see it taken over by these forb species. And in particular, we have things like ragweed, this plant here, which you could thank for your seasonal allergies. We have things like these woody sages. So these, again, are plants that the cattle don't like to eat. So if we were to lose all of our insect species in our systems, we would end up with a system that's problematic for ranchers because they wouldn't have enough forage for their cattle, and you wouldn't have a steak or a hamburger on your plate for dinner tonight either. All right, so speaking of consumption, insects also play a role as predators or parasites in our ecosystems, in addition to being herbivores. So insects are the main predators of other insects. For example, in this top photo here, we have a praying mantis eating a moth. So they're helping keep those populations of our insects in check. And then more than 80,000 species of insects are parasitoids. So these are insects that lay their eggs inside of other insects. Those eggs hatch into larvae, and then they start eating that host from the inside out until eventually they might pupate and emerge as adults to go lay their eggs in another host. So again, it's the stuff of horror stories, but these are the ecological processes that help regulate populations of other species in these really complicated food webs. So critical for our ecosystem function. And then insects also serve as food for other species. So more than 5,000 species of mammals and birds specialize on eating insects, like, for example, this giant anteater that's feeding on a termite mound. And without mammals, we could say that food webs probably would look pretty different. But without insects, food webs would completely collapse because so many species rely on insects for their food source. So really critical for all of the other animals that we might love more than the insects that we see around us. And then insects also play a big role in maintaining healthy soils. They break down dead material like plants and animals that have died and are decomposing. And then as they move through the soil systems, they break up soils into smaller aggregates as well. And they're critical for a few very specific purposes that humans love, things like silk production. Any silk fabric is coming from an insect. Silkworms were cultivated more than 5,000 years ago, starting in China, and now they are completely domesticated. They cannot survive by themselves in the wild anymore. So we can thank these silkworms for the production of all of our silk fabrics. And they're also really important as model organisms for science. So insects have pretty short generation times and these tiny body sizes, and that makes them really easy to rear in the lab and experiment on. And they have become critical for our understanding of things like genetics. So for example, much of our knowledge about genetics comes from studying fruit flies, which are shown in this top picture. They're essential for our knowledge of physiology and movement, as I discussed earlier with the roach example. Thinking about biochemistry and behavior, all of these topics have been touched on through research on insects in scientific labs. So really critical organisms, not only for our understanding of the world, but also our ability to survive in the world. So hopefully I have convinced you that insects are really important. We have got to have them. And now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the global trends with insects. What is happening with them out in our world? And unfortunately, it is a pretty bleak picture. So we are documenting over the past several decades a massive decline in the number of insects that we have out in the world around us, which, as you can imagine, after I just told you about all the critical roles they play in our ecosystems and for our health and livelihoods, this is a big problem. So we're seeing here in this graph a bunch of different groups of insects, caddisflies at the top. These are insects that have an aquatic larval form, and then they emerge into terrestrial systems as adults. They're really critical for our food webs. And over the past decade, we have seen a 68% drop in the number of individual caddisflies that we have in our systems. Butterflies have dropped by about half. Beetles and bees about the same, as well as many other groups of insects. So overall, the global insect population is estimated to have declined by 41% over just the past 10 years. So this is pretty damning evidence, but the evidence at this point is still circumstantial. So there's relatively few studies, only 73 studies as of 2019 went into making these estimates. And every single one of them showed a decline in insects, either a massive decline shown in the reddish pink color at the top graph here, or they're at a threatened status shown in the orange. None of them showed that these populations were doing well, but we don't have very much data to back this up. However, we do have our own individual observations as well, so some more circumstantial evidence. This cartoon, I think, depicts it well. This is the windshield phenomenon. We're back in the 90s. If you were driving around out in the country, you would come home with your windshield plastered with bugs, right? I can remember as a kid, one of my chores to get my allowance was washing my dad's car, and I was scrubbing those bugs off the car on a bi-weekly basis. Now in 2020, when we were driving around, we don't have very many bugs on our windshields. And I think this cartoon really captures it well, that by 2050, if we don't reverse this trend, we won't be in our cars because we won't be existing in the way we know now without our insect populations. And so we need to really do a lot more to try and understand these trends and study what's happening. And here at UNCG, we are doing some of this work ourselves in collaboration with a wide group of people across the continent here. So we have set up these malaise traps, which I'm showing here in the image at the top, where we're collecting insects that we then identify and count to see what is the trend that's happening here in Greensboro with our insect populations. And then we're contributing this to a big network of sites. So I'll remind you, the previous data that we had was coming from about 20 different sites across North America, a good number, but not a ton. And now with this network, we have 213 sites across Canada and the United States, each of which are sampling across multiple years and multiple time points within a season to see what is the trend in all of these different insect groups over time. So hopefully we here at UNCG, as well as all of these investigators at these sites across the country, will be contributing to this picture and contributing to our knowledge of what's happening to our insects. So I'll come back in 3 years and let you know what we found. So how do we conserve our insects? What is the problem? I showed you this figure before showing that there's way more insects on the planet than there are any other species. So how do we consider them in our conservation efforts? So this is our conservation spending shown in this pie graph here. Just within the US, this is conservation dollars that are going to individual species. And surprisingly to me, the vast majority of our conservation spending is going to fish. And in particular, two fish species. We really care about salmon and we really care about steelhead trout on the West Coast. So we're putting a lot of conservation dollars into protecting those species, which I think is great. But we're spending a lot less money on other groups. So we spend about 9% of our conservation dollars on mammals, 6% on birds, 2% on plants, and only 0.5% on insects. And I think this really goes back to the ideas about hating them and loving them, right? Not a lot of people have a lot of love for insects. So of course, we're not going to be putting our conservation money towards these important species in our systems. So what are the threats to our insect populations? We have things like climate change, increasing CO2, habitat loss, pesticide use, and light pollution. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of these for the rest of the talk here. The first one, climate change. We know that humans are changing our climate and we're globally increasing our temperatures. Every year, we're breaking a new record for our temperatures on our planet. And this is a really bad thing for a lot of insect species that depend on the temperatures that they have evolved in for many, many millions of years. And these are just two examples of stoneflies. Again, they're insects that don't get a lot of attention, but they're really critical parts of many food webs. So they have an aquatic larval form, and then they emerge as adults into terrestrial systems. So they're eaten by fish, they're eaten by birds and mammals, supporting many of the animal species that people tend to care a lot more about. These two particular species really depend on cold water. So the western glacial stonefly likes to live in melting pools of glacial water in its aquatic form. The meltwater Lednian stonefly lives in our alpine systems. Here's a little image of one right here. You could see its aquatic form living in the snow melt running off of these rocky slopes within the mountains. And these two species are drastically declining in abundance because their habitats are warming and they don't have the right temperature water to live in anymore. Here's another maybe more charismatic species that people can get behind, the Arctic bumblebee. This bee pollinates many different flowers in our Arctic ecosystems. It likes to sit in cone-shaped flowers to soak up the rays of the sun, and it has this nice fuzzy sweater to keep it warm once it's done that. But again, with climate change, it's getting way too hot for that fuzzy sweater. And so this species is also at risk because of climate change. Its populations have declined drastically, and that means that the plants that it pollinates are also declining in their population sizes. So those are just two species that are being impacted by climate change. Of course, there's many, many others that we should be trying to protect as well. We can also think about increasing CO2. This is, of course, what's driving our changing climate as a greenhouse gas, but it also has direct consequences for insects in our environments. So in this figure, we're looking through time on the x-axis at the green line showing how much plant growth there is back in our tallgrass prairie site in Kansas. And we see as CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere over time, we're seeing plants growing more and more. You would think that might be a good thing, but we're also seeing that those plants are becoming less and less nutritious. So the gray line here is showing nutrient dilution. And as we have increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, the plants are growing more, they're photosynthesizing more, but there's not any more nutrients in the soil for them to take up. So all of that plant growth is nutrient limited. So these plants are going from something that's akin to spinach on the left-hand side, really nutritionally dense, to being more akin to iceberg lettuce in our current times. They're not nutritionally dense, not really good food for the insects that depend upon them, right? So here we're looking at now nutrient dilution on this x-axis and the number of grasshopper species we have over time on our y-axis. And as these plants are becoming less and less nutritious, the grasshopper species are declining in abundance as well. So CO2 is not only changing our climate, it's also changing the nutrient landscape for the insects that depend on these plants for food. We're also drastically changing the landscape around us, the habitat of our insects. So these are images from around Greensboro. The right-hand side here shows our natural landscape, our beautiful deciduous forests that have lots of plant material for insects to live within and to feed upon, these mossy, rocky outcrops that can serve as habitat for insects, lots of leaf litter down here at the bottom and twigs for, again, insects to make their homes in. And we are converting this to our urban and suburban systems, right? So now we have lots of pavement where insects probably aren't going to exist very well. We have homogenized our yards. So we have a bunch of grass. We're blowing all our leaves and raking our leaves away every fall so insects don't have a lot of habitat to live within. And then we have very few plant species for them to specialize on and eat. So we're changing our landscape through urbanization, reducing the habitat for our insects. We're also changing it through agricultural intensification. So in this case, I didn't have to paste two images together here. This is one continuous picture where we see a diverse natural landscape out here around the edges. And again, a homogeneous agricultural field here in the middle. So clearly, just visually, we can see that we are changing our landscape for our insects, altering their habitat. The other thing we're doing with agricultural intensification is adding a lot of chemicals into our systems. And relatively recently, we've developed a new form, a new class of chemicals called neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoid translates directly to mean new nicotine-like insecticides. And there's a whole class of these chemicals. I'm just showing a few of them here. They were originally discovered in tobacco plants, so that's why they're called new nicotine-like insecticides. Tobacco is really good at naturally defending itself against these insect herbivores by producing these chemical compounds. And now we have isolated them and we can synthesize them in the labs, and we are spreading them in our agricultural fields all across our countries and around the world. And again, I want to dive a little bit into some research that we're doing in my lab, thinking about soybeans. So soybeans are the second largest US crop by acre, and they're the second largest US cash crop, only behind corn. And the United States is actually the world's leader in production of soybean. So this is typically thought of as a relatively environmentally friendly crop. We have low nitrogen fertilizer use in soybean fields because they have this beneficial relationship with bacteria that provide them with nitrogen. These plants are actually putting nitrogen back into the soil instead of taking it out. But soybeans require really intensive pesticide use. So they have these really yummy, nutritionally dense leaves that bugs like to eat. And so agricultural soybean producers are turning to chemicals to try and repel these insects. One way they're doing this is through seed coatings. So these are chemical coatings that they paint onto crop seeds, not just soybeans, but all of the crops that were planted can have these seed coatings that contain things like fungicides, nematicides, and importantly, insecticides. And so our lab wanted to find out what are the consequences of these seed coatings. And so we did a field trial where we looked at 4 different sites across the state of Maryland. This was work that was led by a project member, Kelsey McGurran, where we went out into the field and we planted soybeans that either had these chemical seed coatings that contained these neonicotinoids, the insecticide, and then we also planted soybeans that did not have any insecticides on their seed coatings. And then within those plots, we measured what were the species of insects that we found coming to the plants, how much were those insects consuming, and then a bunch of measurements on the plants themselves. How much did they grow and how many soybeans did they produce? And what we found was that these insecticides are doing their job. So when we have seeds that were coated by our insecticide, we see many fewer insect herbivores in those plots than seeds that were not coated by the insecticides. But we also see that they're maybe doing too good of a job. So we see a decrease in the number of pollinators when we add these insecticide coatings as well. This is an unintended consequence of these insecticides in these soybean fields. And then when we look at the plants themselves, we see absolutely no difference in terms of the number or the amount of damage that these insects are doing on these leaves. We see no difference in the amount that these plants are growing, the plant biomass, and we see absolutely no difference in the total yield of soybeans at the end of the season. So this is the economic output of these soybean fields. So we're adding all of these insecticides, we're decreasing our insect populations, and we're having no impact on the plants that we are trying to protect from these insects. And this can be really damaging when we think about the bigger picture here. So these neonicotinoids are actually contaminating entire ecosystems beyond just the agricultural fields we're applying them in. So those coated seeds could be impacting birds that are eating those seeds. The neonicotinoids that are being sprayed across our fields create these contaminated dust or runoff that's impacting invertebrates in our adjacent ecosystems. They're impacting the treated plants themselves, which then are impacting things like our pollinators, and they're disrupting food webs in the surrounding ecosystems. And it's estimated that only 5% of these applied neonicotinoids, these toxic chemicals, are staying within the plants that we're applying them to. 95% of them are rushing out into the surrounding environments with negative consequences. And again, I'll just give two quick examples here of animals we might care a little bit more about than insects. So birds can be really highly impacted by the application of these pesticides. They tend to be eating a lot of our insects, and these birds that are eating insects that have been treated with these neonicotinoids are losing weight after eating these insects. The chemical acts as an appetite suppressant, so they're not eating as much, and they become really lethargic, which has problems for their migrations, as well as issues for their reproduction. So our bird populations are negatively impacted by our application of these chemicals. We're also impacting our fish populations. So many aquatic invertebrates serve as food sources for our fish. And as these toxic chemicals are running off of our agricultural fields into our waterways, they're impacting things like these rainbow smelts that are pictured here on the left-hand side. So fish that we care about, fish that we want to eat, are negatively impacted by our application of insecticides in our agricultural fields. And it's not just our agricultural fields that are the problem here. So US lawns cover 49,000 square miles of the United States. This is a land area bigger than the state of North Carolina is covered by lawns within our country. And in those lawns, we're applying 59 million pounds of insecticides every single year. So if you can picture in your head 4,500 African elephants, or maybe 1,100 excavators, this is the amount of pesticides that we're applying to our lawns across our country. And again, this is having major impacts for the insects that would potentially live within those habitats. And then our final change that we are impacting our environment with is thinking about our night landscape. So oftentimes as humans, we are turning on the lights outside at night so we can feel safe and so that we can see where we're going. And this is, again, having impacts on our insects. So you might have seen something like this when you turn a light on at night. An insect comes to that light and is circling around and around at the light. And we actually just last year, there was a paper published that explained this behavior. So normally at night, the moon and the stars up above provide the light source, right? This is how insects evolved. And insects therefore evolved to keep their back to the light that was way up in the sky provided by the moon and the stars. This was how they could tell what was up and what was down, so they could keep flying forward. Now we've introduced a light source that is much brighter and much closer to them. And so as they're trying to keep their back to the light, they're just circling around that light over and over and over again, just using this behavior that they evolved with over the past 500 million years. And so we've all heard the saying, like a moth to a flame. These insects are coming towards our light sources, and then once they get there, they're just circling, keeping their backs to the light. And unfortunately, 1 out of every 3 of these insects that come to your lights at night are going to be dead by the morning. They exhaust themselves, they're not looking for food, they run out of energy, and they just can't make it anymore. And this maybe wouldn't be a problem if we had one light on at night, but I'm sure you've seen images like this within our country and around the world. We are changing the night landscape. We are turning on our lights at a big scale. And again, this is impacting our insects around the world. So I've told you about the 5 reasons why we think insects are declining. What will you do to help our insect populations? There's some easy things that you can try and do to help the insects that we depend on within our society. You can reduce your energy usage and switch to clean energy sources to try and reduce climate change and reduce CO2 in our atmosphere. You can plant diverse gardens that have plants that flower in all different seasons so that your insect populations around your home have lots of different food sources throughout the year. You can leave your leaves in the fall, so don't rake everything up, or at least rake them to a small pile within your yard so that there's still habitat for these insects to overwinter. You can reduce pesticide use in your own yards, and you can also buy organic pesticide-free produce to try and encourage agricultural producers to use less pesticides in their fields as well. And then you could turn off your outdoor lights as well. So again, what are you going to do to try and help our important insects? And I want to just end here with this quote from Dr. Jane Memmott, that you personally cannot help the tigers and the whales and the elephants, but you really can do something for the insects and the birds and the plants that are all local to your ecosystem. So again, I'll just ask you, what are you going to do? What behavior are you going to change to try and help these insects going forward? And so I'll end there and say thank you very much for your participation and your attention. If you want to learn more about our lab's work, you can go to our website at communitydynamicslab.com. If you're a student at UNCG, I teach entomology in the fall, so you're welcome to join our class if you want to learn more about insects. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and I would be very happy to take any questions.
That's great, Kim. Thank you so much. I'll give you a second to get some water. You've been doing a lot of talking. I see we do have a hand raised, but I want to get to the questions that were in the chat first. So Houston asked, could our fear and disgust of insects come from grooming behavior and parasite removal by our early human ancestors?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, there's a reason why we might be afraid of insects, and it's because there are some insects that are dangerous to humans, right? So we probably have evolved this innate fear of these things that in some part are dangerous. So things like grooming behavior, parasite removal, these are all things that could have caused us to have this feeling of disgust or fear towards insects. And we just have to remind ourselves when we're out in the world that most insects out there are either benign or beneficial to us, right? There's a small subset that are really harmful. So we shouldn't be going out with our shoe, smashing every insect that's out there. We should target our approach to only try and remove the ones that are really harmful for us.
Yeah. And then Cynthia asked, does the increase in CO2 also impact the nutritional quality of the vegetables that we eat, like corn and soybeans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say probably in the absence of agriculture, it would, right? But in agricultural fields, we are also simultaneously applying lots of fertilizers with our insecticides. And so in those agricultural systems, we have a lot of those nutrients that the plants can take up while they're also increasing their photosynthetic rates. So increasing their growth and their nutrition can keep along with that growth. So this is more in the natural systems that the plants that we have are reducing their nutritional quality as they're growing more.
Yeah, and Cynthia, and I would add that it's not just climate change, but it's also our farming practices. The soils, Kim talked about how healthier soils mean healthier plants and more nutrient-rich plants, and monocropping really reduces the different types of nutrients in soils. And if they're not doing cover crops or they're not rotating crops, I think that's really reducing that. And then genetic modified organisms too. There are just fewer varieties of corn and potatoes and bananas that we can eat. And I think that also reduces their nutrient content. Now, I did see somebody raised a hand earlier, but I don't see it up anymore. Did somebody else have a question for Kim? You can keep thinking about it. I do have one, Kim. You highlighted a couple of specific insects, and I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, it's going to take kind of all of the above solutions to kind of fix the sixth extinction that we're in. But have there been any examples of insects that serve as a keystone species in like a biome or certain ecologies? You know, I particularly think of like what happened to Yellowstone when we reintroduced wolves into that environment. Has anything like that happened with insects?
Yeah, I would say there's a few that I would consider to be keystone species that if we try and protect them, they'll have these cascading impacts to protect all the insects in those ecosystems. And primarily, they tend to be the aquatic insects. So again, things that have these aquatic larval forms like our caddisflies, our mayflies, they emerge in mass, often in the spring, and then are food sources for many terrestrial species as well, including birds and spiders and other mammals. And so with the focus on fisheries, there's a lot of focus on protecting those aquatic insects because they serve as the basis of those food webs for those fisheries. So without the insects, the fisheries would completely collapse. And we care, as our conservation dollars show, we care a lot about keeping our fish around so that we can continue to eat them. But there's also some great examples of much more charismatic species. So we could think about things like the monarch butterfly has captured a lot of the public's attention because they're just cool. They're beautiful. They take on these mass migrations up and down the entire continent of North America. So they capture people's imagination. They have our admiration, and so there's a lot of conservation effort going towards protecting monarch butterflies. And I would say the same for honeybees, right? These are non-native species, the honeybees that pollinate all of our crops to North America, but people are really interested in saving the bees, and for good reason, because the bees are really critical for our agricultural economy.
Thanks. Yeah, that's good to know. Houston had a follow-up that I'm happy to answer. They're wondering if the impact of CO2 levels would increase the demand for fertilizers. And I guess if you want to take it, but we can talk about how plant life, animal life is adapting to the changing climate and I think making them less robust. Like they don't have the adaptability because, like you said, they've evolved to meet a certain type of environment and live and thrive in a certain environment, and human impact is changing that. And so I think they're just my take is that they're just struggling evolutionarily to do this. And so that's when we have to kind of more human interaction. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I
I
would
don't know if
add
I said
that.
that very well, but
No, totally. I think species are not able to adapt as quickly to the changing environment for sure. But I would also add that we have historically added massive amounts of fertilizers to our crops. So, like, we're well beyond what the crops actually need to begin with. And so I think the increasing CO2 levels are not going to change the demand for fertilizer because we already dump so much fertilizer onto our fields. It really, it's overkill to begin with.
thanks. And Tanner, did you want to ask? I saw you left a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it, or do you want me
Yeah, sure,
to
I
read
can.
it? Go.
Okay, so when you showed that chart with all the insect orders with the caddisflies and the lepidopterans underneath it, I noticed all the ones towards the top that had the most percent decline were all holometabolists. Is that like, do you think there's a reason for that, or is it just like coincidence?
Yeah, that's a really good question and not something I've thought about, but I do have a guess. So great knowledge from entomology. So holometabolous insects are the ones that go through that complete metamorphosis, right? So they have eggs, they have larvae, those larvae pupate and reconfigure their body shapes, and they emerge as adults that look totally different than the larvae. And this is in contrast to hemimetabolous insects that they don't go through complete metamorphosis. They kind of start out as little baby versions of what they're going to grow up to become. And so my guess is that because those holometabolous insects, the ones that go complete metamorphosis, they use very different habitat types through different stages of their life, right? So the larvae are probably specialized on a very different habitat than the adults. So there's a lot more chances for their growth and reproduction to be stopped by people and our activities, right? So maybe they could make it if they only had to be in their larval form, but the adults are being killed by our activities, or vice versa. Maybe the adults could survive, but the larvae are all being targeted. So that would be my guess, but I don't know anyone who has looked into it more. It's a really good question.
Thank you for joining us. We did record the video, and it will be posted to our sustainability YouTube page in the coming weeks. And we'll thank you, Josh. We'll make sure to notify everybody when that's available. And I was going to share one last resource for our students and people out in the community. We do have a list of resources on our sustainability page to help you go green at home, including doing all of these things that Kim talked about, helping resources to help you reduce your energy consumption and improve gardening and improve your natural landscaping at home as well. So I encourage you to follow us on Instagram at Sustainable UNCG. And we do have a newsletter available on our website that you can find as well. So we'll definitely be having more talks in the coming months. And if you're a student on campus, we'll definitely be having some more events on campus for Earth Day in April. So thank you again, Dr. Komatsu. We really appreciate it. Very informative. And I hope everybody has a great day and gets outside and enjoys the sunshine.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.